The abolitionist movement has been a point of contention and controversy over the decades in American history. And it's one of the few historical subjects that I feel is not challenged enough. And so, with that being said, white ministers and black ministers within the abolitionist movement defined equality as perhaps some of us would hold as common sense, as different definitions of equality. But a lot of people, unfortunately, are not aware of this massive discrepancy because just because one was anti-slavery does not mean that they were pro-civil rights. So just a little bit on what will be covered tonight. First, we're going to examine just a brief introductory context of the 1619 Project and 1776 Commission, because the issue of African American equality and the race issue is very much prevalent today. And this debate that we're going to be examining in its historical context is history's predecessor to our modern debate that we're having today. We're also going to be discussing just a little bit on Bacon's Rebellion and the merging of two very profound national narratives. We're also going to be just touching just a little bit on the early Christian pursuit of the abolition of slavery. But the core of what we're going to be talking about tonight is actually we're going to be examining historical sermons from the Confederate South, the ministers of the white ministers of the abolitionist movement, covering roughly from 1860 to 1861, because next to the Emancipation Proclamation, that's where the discussion of the abolition of slavery in religious discourse was really taking off in different churches across the nation. But more so, we're going to be really examining the personal papers, speeches, and sermons from African American abolitionist ministers, because their voice has unfortunately been it's still not being heard as much as it should today. So I aim to bring that to light. And so, but at the end, we're going to be revisiting how the voices of this profound debate are manifesting in our present through the lens of the 1619 Project versus the 1776 Commission debate. So, with history, a lot of times can be filled with voices from our past that are echoing into modern society today. So, the definition of equality for African Americans amongst white and black ministers, as I briefly alluded to earlier, is profoundly different, consisting of different endgames. The definitions of equality within the abolitionist movement was a significant factor, I contend, in the institutionalization of the black church and the white church, as culture has come to call them. This trend is primarily reflected from the Civil War to our present, but there were trends kind of along these lines forming before the Civil War. And because white and black ministers could not unite on the definition of what constituted equality for African Americans, the divisions were just solidified from there, kind of creating like a snowball effect where it just got bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of a problem. And the 1619 Project and 1776 Commission camps of thought are a modern reflection of these voices. So what in the world is the 1619 Project and the 1776 Commission? I'm glad you asked. So the 1619 Project may be familiar to some of you, but it's a long-form journalistic endeavor pioneered primarily by Nicole Hannah-Jones and other authors, and that was unveiled in August 2019 through New York Times Magazine. And it's since expanded into a podcast series, a multi-episode documentary on Hulu, and different forms of media. But basically, what the 1619 Project aims to do is to raise a significant challenge to our traditional founding narrative that basically held that the founding fathers were a unique group of individuals that just literally transcended the historical era that we're in to create a profound and unique political experiment, the greatest of which the world has ever known. So the 1619 Project in particular aims to bring slavery as a central component of our nation's founding history. Now, the 1776 Commission was created as one of then President Donald Trump's last acts of his administration in late 2020 to promote a more patriotic curriculum to counter the 1619 Project's claims, whatever that means. So, with the modern debate, we have to ask a few honest questions I hope that this lecture will attempt to answer. Did America's foundation begin with the arrival of the White Lion slave ship and the arrival of the first African slaves and indentured servants in 1619 Virginia? Or did America's foundations begin with the arrival of the Pilgrims in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620 with escaping religious persecution from England? So these are very important questions. And of course, did American history really begin on July 4th, 1776? And I guess in our American-centered viewpoint that literally nothing else before that mattered? I guess not. So the limited scopes and perspectives of both of these curriculums, I feel, are woefully insufficient to discuss the massive complexities of American history as a whole, because both sides only address one side or the other, but there's a lot more complex issues that need to be unpacked. So when I talk about American history, I talk about American history being a tale of two ships just because American society has become hyper-focused on 1619 and 1620. Now, that's not to say, of course, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria way before, but also, if we really want to add some humor to the mix, what about the Vikings? They always seem to get lost around Columbus Day, right, which is coming up next month. But the White Lion, of course, symbolizes the ship that constitutes the 1619 Project voice, and the Mayflower, of course, is based more in the conventional narratives of that you've been taught in public school generally. So, continuing on, what I contend American history actually portrays are two different forms of oppression that need to be told together as one very in-depth story in terms of our national founding. One is with 1619. There was racial and class oppression with African slavery and indentured servants and European indentured servants to a degree, with oppression from typically white, wealthy colonial elites, which we'll examine in a second. And with 1620, of course, we have religious persecution where the English separatists and pilgrims were oppressed by the State Church of England coming to the New World on the Mayflower. But from the early stages of American history, conflicts were primarily centralized in the paradigm of the rich oppressing the poor, be it the separatists or the slaves and indentured servants being oppressed by the wealthy colonial establishment or the State Church of England, respectively. So we're going to see what we should be seeing is a merging of two national narratives, because I'm going to now talk about Bacon's Rebellion. And that's not to be confused, of course, with the popular breakfast food of the same name, although I do love my bacon. So Bacon's Rebellion was an event that has gotten lost in the annals of colonial American history. But basically, the conflict pitted Nathaniel Bacon and his allies versus colonial Virginia Governor William Berkeley's forces. So basically, the central element of that conflict was that Governor Berkeley refused Bacon's request to lead a coalition of troops to drive out Native Americans from Virginia because of repeated attacks, depending on who you talk to. So, but Bacon's group was composed of your proverbial ragtag group of very diverse array of individuals with European indentured servants, free Africans, indentured African servants, and also enslaved Africans. I use the term Africans because the United States wasn't a country at that time, but more or less, it definitely makes this a very peculiar conflict. So basically, this ragtag group of individuals rose up against Governor Berkeley's forces. But what ultimately happened is that the rebellion is put down. But what we see from this event that doesn't get talked about much is the hardening of the racial caste of slavery and the beginning of what would become Jim Crow segregation, particularly with the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 and other different acts that were passed. So the reality of what American history tends to be presenting here, as we will see, is that it's the wealthy colonial establishment divided whites and blacks against one another, when at one time they were working in solidarity for a common purpose, the rich versus the poor. So now to just transition to talk about a little bit of the beginnings of the abolitionist movement, because it's important for our context. So this document that you see here is the 1688 Germantown Quaker Proclamation against slavery. And this is actually currently in the archives at Haverford College, right outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My history nerdum isn't showing or anything, but I literally just scheduled some time just so I can go up there and hold the thing. We history nerds like holding old documents. Gotta have some fun, right? But this document is significant because it was considered as the first protest against slavery made by a religious body in the 13 colonies, but in addition to that, was widely considered one of, if not the first declaration of human rights in the Western Hemisphere. So this is important because Christians were pursuing the destruction of slavery early on, demonstrating biblical principles that condemn slavery and oppression, which we'll examine later on. So now we're going to really be getting into the central component of tonight's lecture, getting to the good stuff, going back to where it all really took off. So with voices from our past, I'm going to aim to demonstrate how the voices of the 1619 Project and 1776 Commission were being echoed in the abolitionist movement and also by Confederate ministers in various manners. So now with the issue of denominations. So just a little bit from a Christian viewpoint. So we're going to be kind of examining just how these ministers used biblical principles to pursue the abolition of slavery, but also how some egregiously perverted it to defend it when it does no such thing. But basically with the issue of denominations, the Bible conveys one unified message of one church and one people of God, even though we see how well the whole Reformation worked out with the branching off of like thousands of different denominations. But anyway, the minister is called to preach the whole counsel of God's word from Genesis to Revelation. Therefore, just for the sake of this presentation, denominations were not considered, but we're looking at these individuals precisely as individuals with where they stood with their writings. So just to discuss briefly my research methodology. So we'll have two sermons that we'll first be looking at from the Confederate South from the 1860s. We will also be examining two sermons from white abolitionist ministers from the 1860 to 1861 timeframe in particular, when the discussion of this important subject was really taking off next to the Emancipation Proclamation's passage and its fallout. But we're really going to be focusing primarily on four different African-American ministers whose voices, just for the sake of time, there would have been more present, but just for the sake of time, we're focusing on four of the more more basically recognizable ones: Henry Highland Garnet, Frederick Douglass, Hiram Revels, and James W.C. Pennington. Now, there's no way to get around it, but of course, slavery was at the heart of the Civil War. It was the issue that caused the war. Some good old boy may try to say that, well, it was about states' rights, but I ask, what was the states' rights being defended? So we have various declarations of secession from states that seceded to form the Confederate States of America that actually said that they were separating from the Union because of slavery. And got to do a little bit of a book plug, but I'm selling my books, Freedom's Proclamation, but this content is really discussed in depth in this book. So if you're just a casual student of history, or you just want a good read, check this out, because this is where you're going to really see the heart of like what's being discussed at length and in depth. But the Confederate Constitution itself maintained the following in this article and section that's listed here. And it says, in all such territory, the institution of Negro slavery as it now exists in the Confederate States shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government, and the inhabitants of the several Confederate States and territories shall have the right to take such territory any slaves lawfully held by them in any of the states or territories of the Confederate States. So that's the states' rights being defended. So just to touch a little bit on some common themes of Confederate theology. First, we see the defense of slavery as a morally just institution. We see very blatant white supremacy, and we see the Confederate cause as an issue of defending states' rights in the context of advancing or protecting slavery. But there was even a couple sermons that I came across, which are featured more in the book, where the Union was painted as Pharaoh wanting to enslave the South. Talk about ironic. Now, the first sermon of the South that we'll be examining is entitled Ezra's Dilemma. So it was delivered on August 21st, 1863. But here we see the strategy of deflecting the issue onto historical predecessors that came before us. Who did the wrong and who bears the evil? Where did these slaves come from and who brought them here? Alluding to the British Empire. They came from their native haunts, brought here by the forefathers. Those slaves were imposed upon us in many cases against our wills. Like we couldn't make our own decisions to let them go, but we didn't want to. Imposed on us just so long as it was profitable for these hypocrites to bring them here. And now when they have become interwoven with our whole social life, was this our breeding? Have they committed the wrong and took money for it? I receive their full bond, flesh, and all the right, whether in the sight of man or God, to dictate to us who have paid the bond and rescued. And the words that are being used here are of the time period, and it's a very sensitive issue, but this is the context and the language that was being used. And rescued the poor savages from their greedy and bloody grasp, and made men and Christians of them. Blatant white supremacy. James Worley Miles with another sermon, God and History. Basically, this sermon talked about how the Confederacy was the greatest thing since the invention. Well, what would be the big invention from that time? We get in the habit of saying since the invention of sliced bread. Maybe that might be the more adept description, but humor me. He says, and I quote, "We have a great lesson to teach the world with respect to the relation of races, that certain races are permanently inferior in their capacities to others." Take note that this was from a minister proclaiming this, just egregiously misinterpreting biblical text, which we'll really unpack later on. And that the African who is entrusted to our care can only reach the amount of civilization and development of which he is capable, can only contribute to the benefit of humanity in the position in which God has placed him among us. So the South says that it wasn't about slavery, but it was about states' rights, that it wasn't founded on white supremacy. This clearly suggests otherwise. So now we're going to be transitioning into the abolitionist movement. So we have to ask, how is equality defined in the abolitionist movement? So how did white ministers in the movement and black ministers discuss equality? How were terms such as oppression and liberty and different such terms used? How was equality defined? How is God's word being spoken in the pulpits, papers, and addresses of ministers in the abolitionist movement? We're going to find out now. So just to cover a brief survey of theology that I uncovered in my research of the theology of white abolitionist ministers, we first see the institution of slavery as a massive contradiction to God's biblical mandate to love others. We see slavery as a sin against God and man. We also see, in particular, with this third point, emancipation equals equality. That's where I'm going to want you to keep that in your minds as we proceed. Equality is described additionally in the context of loving others as ourselves, the golden rule. But there's a significant absence of advocacy for enfranchisement for African Americans in the form of political and social rights, particularly the right to vote. So this sermon, called The Church and the Slave Power, was presented by Stephen Montfort Vale in January 1860. But this individual I found interesting because compared to his counterparts, he actually did touch on equal justice. But we'll see how it was defined in this particular sermon. And I wanted to post the paper here because they had a lot nicer paper back then than we do. I like that gold color. Got to have a little bit of fun with it. But in terms of loving your neighbor, he had this to say. But I must utter my entire dissent, referring to the second to last paragraph here. But I must utter my entire dissent. It is unchristian and anti-Christian. At one blow, it destroys the second table of the law, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, referring to slavery's massive contradiction. Slavery is not doing to others as we would have others do to us. Slavery is not doing to others as we would have others do to us. It is, on the contrary, doing to others as we would not have them do to us. No willing, willful slaveholder can either keep the law of love or the golden rule. And he asks a very pertinent question. What willful slaveholder is willing to change circumstances with his slave in one single respect? None of them. Now, on the matter of equal justice, he had this very interesting passage. He writes, "The powers that be are ordained of God, then not to be the ministers of evil, but to the ministers of good. Not to muzzle the mouth of God's servant, but to protect him in his heaven-appointed work. Civil government is good, and judges dispensing equal justice between man and man sit in the place of God, and are to be held in all honor when confining themselves to their legitimate sphere. Rulers are to be a terror to evil workers and not to those that do good." So he touches briefly on equal justice here. The only thing is he doesn't really expand on what that entails. So the next sermon that we're going to be looking at is from Ezra Eastman Adams from 1861, entitled "The Temple and the Throne, the True Foundations." So in this sermon, he writes the following. "We may not attribute to an evil system the blessings which God in his sovereignty causes it to evolve. We experience a joyous relief when we see the hand of providence working. Through the sins and sorrows of men, happiness for his kingdom and glory for himself. Men may be voluntary perpetrators of oppression and crime, while they are the blind agents of the divine purposes. The weighty and unmitigated evil of slavery consists in the influence on our national character and condition. This is American slavery." So here we see in the second passage that the term oppression is incorporated here. But as you can see, it's only in the context of emancipation from slavery, and there's an absence of language of racial prejudice or advancing the right to vote to African Americans or acknowledging them as citizens. So now we're really going to be getting into the heart of the matter with the Black voice. What were Black ministers saying on this issue? So just a little bit on Black minister theology. We see one that in their theology, God is the ultimate arbiter of racial justice and emancipation, and we need to hold this too. We also see a 100-fold increase on the language on enfranchisement of the African Americans in the form of political rights and social autonomy. Political advocacy is also present to outlaw racially oppressive legislation or programs. And we also see, of course, last but not least, language on emancipation from slavery, of course. So, this sermon called Let the Monster Perish is from Henry Highland Garnet. And he would be an individual who would escape from slavery, and he actually delivered this sermon in 1865. But he talks about the hateful handmaid of slavery, particularly with the first passage, which is the one we'll focus on here. It is the highly concentrated essence of all conceivable wickedness, theft, robbery, pollution, unbridled passion, incest, cruelty, cold-blooded murder, blasphemy, and defiance of the laws of God. It teaches children to disregard parental authority. Of course, this is referring to slavery. It tears down the marriage altar and tramples its sacred ashes under its feet. It creates and nourishes polygamy. It feeds and pampers its hateful handmaid prejudice. So as you can see, Garnet clearly distinguishes them as two separate issues, of which only white ministers tended to only introduce the emancipation aspect and not its hateful handmaid of racial prejudice. And of course, pretty much all of us would know who this gentleman is. I sometimes joke with my wife, wondering if maybe what I might look like if I might get my hair styled like his, but I would need a lot of volume. But I don't think I'd be able to pull it off. But anyway, Frederick Douglass had a significant address called What to the Slave is the 4th of July from July 5th, 1852. And he had this to say on the gross injustice and cruelty of the slave system. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which lie is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants. Brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings. Just to touch briefly, we see the term equality invoked here, but clearly it does not mean the same thing to African Americans as it does to their white counterparts. With all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Now, naturally, what would be a Civil War presentation without history's proverbial two-edged sword coming up, Abraham Lincoln? So, I've heard a tour guide I was at when I went on a trip to Israel once. He talked about an individual who said, I know everything there is to know about the Palestine and Israel conflict. And when he went there and he got done, he then said, I know nothing about the Israel and Palestine conflict. Hence, with Lincoln, we may think we know something, but then when we go into a panel or a discussion on Abraham Lincoln, we end up more confused than ever. But I came across this fascinating letter that Frederick Douglass actually wrote, dated from September 16th, 1864, which can actually be located in the Library of Congress. In clear as about as clear as you can get, he writes the following: "I see no purpose on the part of Lincoln and his friends to extend the elective franchise to the colored people of the South, but to the contrary, this is extremely dishonorable. The Negro is deemed good enough to fight for the government, but not good enough to vote or enjoy the right to vote in the government." So now we're going to be transitioning to Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels was a Reverend and who was the first African American senator ever elected to Congress. And what we'll be examining is excerpts from the state of Georgia congressional address from 1870. He writes, or states, "I stand today on this floor to appeal for protection from the strong arm of the government for her loyal children, irrespective of color and race, who are citizens of the southern states and particularly of the state of Georgia." So here we clearly see that they're advocating for racial equality for very obvious reasons. "I am well aware, sir, that the idea is abroad that an antagonism exists between the whites and blacks, that the race which the nation, raised from the degradation of slavery and endowed with the full and unqualified rights and privileges of citizenship, are intent upon power at whatever price it can be gained." So there is some propaganda going around indicating that now that African Americans had their political rights and power, that they were going to use that to exact vengeance on their white counterparts. "It has been the well-considered purpose and the aim of a class not confined to the South to spread this charge over the land, and their efforts are as vigorous today to educate the people of this nation into that belief as they were at the close of the war." He continues on, and he incorporates biblical imagery here, which I found quite fascinating from a congressperson. Just being a reverend and a congressionally elected representative, that's a heck of an accomplishment for coming from that time. It was very, very powerful, if you ask me. But he continues on, "In the councils of the great father of all they knew the adjudication of their case, albeit delayed for years, in which patient suffering had nearly exhausted itself, would in the end bring to them the boon for which they sighed, God's most blessed gift to his creatures, the inestimable boon of liberty. They waited, and they waited patiently. In the absence of their masters, they protected their virtue and chastity of defenseless women. Think, sir, for a moment that the condition of this land, what the condition of the land would be today if the slave population had risen in servile insurrection against those who month by month were fighting to perpetuate that institution which brought them to them all the evils which they complained. Where would have been the security for prosperity, female chastity, and childhood's innocence? The bloody counterpart of such a story of cruelty and wrong would have been paralleled only in those chapters of Jewish history as recorded by Josephus." That Josephus reference was a first century Jewish Roman historian who compiled one of the greatest, most in-depth sources on what Roman and Hebrew society was like in the first century. So we clearly see discussion on racial equality and being distinguished from slavery. Now we'll be transitioning to the last of the four, James W.C. Pennington. And I have a passage here from his autobiography, The Fugitive Blacksmith. In 1841, it was widely asserted that Mr. Pennington actually penned one of, if not the first, in-depth historical accounts or histories of African Americans in the United States. But he had this to say: "My feelings are always outraged when I hear them speak of kind masters, the mildest form of slavery." My, how people try to minimize such horrific evils, it's just mind-boggling to me, but nonetheless, it was going on. When Christians and Christian ministers then talk about the mildest form of slavery, I say my feelings are outraged. The opinion seems to prevail that the Negro, after having toiled as a slave for centuries to enrich his white brother to lay the foundations of his proud institutions, after having been sunk as low as slavery can sink him, needs now only a second-rate civilization, a lower standard of civil and religious privileges than the whites claim for themselves. So now just to do a very brief recap of what we just discussed. So with white ministers, in terms of abolitionist theology, we see emancipation as being the all-encompassing sufficient means for African American equality. Equality in their context, from what I've researched, is defined as the golden rule. Love, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And that God, of course, called for slavery's destruction. But with their African American counterparts, we see God as the ultimate arbiter of justice from slavery and racial oppression, and equality is defined as both emancipation and enfranchisement, the two E words of the abolitionist movement: emancipation and enfranchisement, with civil rights and civil equality, with the right to vote, and political advocacy for Black citizenship and enfranchisement. And of course, with Confederate theology, we see two very much evident components. Slavery is defended as a morally benevolent or a just institution for the improvement of social conditions for the enslaved. Anything of the sort. But of course, obviously, spoiler alert, we see white supremacy. So just to briefly recap, to touch on some verses on what the Bible actually says about this important subject. Some will say that Jesus himself never spoke out against slavery, but he actually did so by quoting Isaiah 61 and Luke chapter 4, verses 18 to 19. We also see Paul, who wrote the vast majority of the New Testament, condemning slavery by admonishing Philemon, of which the epistle of the same name is attributed to, or at least named after him, that he was admonished to welcome back Onesimus, who was an escaped slave, as more than a brother, which would have eliminated the enslaved status right from the get-go by that very connotation. Jesus ministered to Samaritans and considered them equals, while Hebrew society racially oppressed them. They saw them as lower than dogs. The Old Testament prophets, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and others, condemn slavery and oppression in various forms. So now we're coming back. Anybody who's a Back to the Future fan, now we get back in the DeLorean and head back to the future here. So we now examine the equality debate in our present. In taking a closer look, based on what we've examined, the Black minister's voice, I would contend, can arguably be characterized as the modern voice of the 1619 Project in our present. There is still so much work that needs to be done in vanquishing racism and modern slavery. The white minister's voice from the abolitionist movement can arguably be characterized to an extent as the modern voice of the 1776 Commission, in arguing that the Civil War served as the be-all, end-all of America's slavery and racism problems. White ministers generally perceived emancipation as the end of both racism and slavery together, but this was clearly not the case. So, with Reconstruction in particular, just through that time period from 1865 to 1877, roughly, African Americans during this time acquired significant political gains with the election of various senators and House of Representative members. This was like a golden age, and they were accomplishing within a generation, like graduating from college and other profound things. But all too soon, after the Union troops left the South with the political compromise of 1877 for Rutherford B. Hayes to win the election, which called for the withdrawal of federal troops, the gains of Reconstruction were rolled back as Confederate loyalists regained control. Black codes and other forms of legislation that were passed systemically led to the disenfranchisement of African Americans once again through vagrancy laws and mass incarceration and others. The cherished 13th Amendment, it says that no one shall be held as a slave except for those who have committed a crime. Loophole. So, as we reach the concluding stretch, the abolitionist movement, in my estimation absolutely did not go far enough. The movement should have also addressed the matter of enfranchisement of African Americans clearly. This is something that both white and black ministers from the start should have been united on one front. But because this was not the case, it led to the institutionalization of the black and the white church, as we now see them in society today, when there never should have been a concept in the first place if we would have worked together. Class conflict, going back to Bacon's Rebellion, was not sufficiently addressed, which resulted in the racial division we have today. If maybe perhaps our history classes would focus more on the dichotomy of how the wealthy were oppressing black and white impoverished people alike, perhaps things may be different. But the ghosts of the past are still reflected in our national psychology or psyche discussed in discourses surrounding race and equality today. Jesus and other writers in Scripture condemned the wealthy for dishonest gain, slavery, and racial oppression, especially robbing workers of their wages. James is particularly vocal about this. But the movement should have addressed the matter of the wealthy in the United States exploiting the poor and solidifying the racial tensions in American society. I really underscore that point because it's central to understanding a lost narrative in our history that needs to be brought back to the forefront. If the abolitionist movement would have been united in terms of the equality question and definition, perhaps we would have never had a need for the social structures of the black and white church when we should have been together, working together in the first place. The abolitionist movement is still very much going on today, with the goal now being the eradication of racial oppression and trafficking. So, racism and oppression can only be eradicated in a transformed heart. It is only through a transformed heart, the transformed human heart, the heart of life, that we will see the realization of Galatians 3:28. There is no Jew or Greek, slave or female, male and female, since you are all one in Christ Jesus. So, ladies and gentlemen, the battle has just begun. That's what I had. Thank you.